Welcome to this FedSoc Forum webinar call. Today, November 20th, 2025, we are delighted to host this conversation with Professor Akhil Reed Amar on his new book entitled Born Equal, Remaking America's Constitution, 1840 to 1920. My name is Matthew Sawtell. I'm Assistant Director of Practice Groups at the Federalist Society. As always, please note that all expressions of opinion are those of the experts on today's call, as the Federalist Society takes no position on particular legal or public policy issues. In the interest of time, we'll keep the introductions brief, but if you'd like to know more about our speakers, you can access their full bios at fedsoc.org. Our moderator for today's discussion is Mr. Adam White. Mr. White is Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and Director of Scalia Law's C. Boyden Gray Center for the Study of the Administrative State. One last note throughout the panel, if you have any questions, please submit them through the question and answer feature in Zoom so that we will have access to them when we get to that portion of the webinar. We do ask that the questions submitted there both pertain to this discussion and end with a question mark. With that, thank you for being with us today. Mr. White, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Matthew. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to be here on Federalist Society webinars, but it's a special pleasure today to be joined by my friend and a scholar I deeply, deeply admire, Professor Amar. Professor Akhil Reed Amar is the Yale University's Sterling Professor of Law and of Political Science. Of course, he's written too many books and articles to count, but his second most recent book is titled The Words That Made Us, America's Constitutional Conversation from 1760 to 1840. Today we're talking about his latest book, the book that follows The Words That Made Us. It's titled, and I have my copy here before me, The Born Equal, Remaking America's Constitution, 1840 to 1920. It's a fascinating book. I really do like it. If you want to see my views on the book, you can look up my Wall Street Journal review and you'll see how much I like this book. It's a tremendous book and a great honor to be here with my friend, Professor Amar, to talk about Born Equal. Professor Amar, welcome.
Thank you. It's an honor right back at you to be with you. I think we're actually going to do more gigs together. And let me just say publicly, thank you for an extremely generous review in the Wall Street Journal. I was aiming for someone like you, and I'm glad it worked. I'm glad, we kind of connected about the book.
Well, it was a pleasure to read. It's a great book, and I'm glad we have a chance to discuss it today. And before we do, maybe the best place to start is actually the previous book. Because, of course, before you can have a book on remaking America's Constitution, you first need a book on making it in the first place, The Words That Made Us, America's Constitutional Conversation. Could you say a few words about that book and the broader trilogy project that these are all a part of?
Yeah, so you mentioned the remaking in volume 2, picking up on the word made in volume 1, the words that made us. And it is a trilogy. It tries to tell the story, in effect, of a quarter millennium, how Americans have actually and interacted constitutionally. Volume 1 of the trilogy, The Words That Made Us, has a pun in its title. The Words That Made the United States, the words that made we the people. That goes from 1760 to 1840, the first 80 years, so to speak. The first 80 years, and I said 80, of course, in Lincolnian fashion. And that book begins before Americans really are Americans. They're instead in 1760s New Yorkers and Virginians and South Carolinians and Pennsylvanians. They don't even talk to each other in newspapers. They talk to London. London talks back to them or at them. And that's 1760. But over the course of 80 years, they come together. Initially kind of in print, they begin reprinting each other's newspaper essays. They meet in person in a Stamp Act Congress in 1765, Continental Congresses in 1774, 75. They decide that they're going to announce their independence unitedly in 1776. They're going to launch new legal regimes state by state with constitutions, democratic constitutions, and articles of confederation, a continental union 1.0, and then they're going to replace that with a much sturdier constitution in 1787 to 89, launched with an epic popular ratification process. They're going to pick a very steady president, George Washington, to help launch the project. There are going to be a series of amendments, what we call the Bill of Rights and the 11th and 12th Amendments, that kind of solidify the system. Power will transfer from one man to another, eventually from one party to another, and the system stabilizes. The landmass will in effect double with the Louisiana Purchase. The population will quadruple, and at the end of that first fourscore-year period, 1840, the founders have all died off. That's a book that features 6 people above all. They're often referred to as the Big Six, the 6 most important founders, America's first 4 presidents, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and the 2 geniuses, Hamilton and Franklin. But by 1840, they've all died. And the question is, will a new generation of Americans be able to carry forward the process and be able to make amends for some of the biggest flaws in the initial document, especially on issues of slavery and equality? Enter volume 2, Born Equal. The big idea of the first book is the making, how we become a we and us. The big idea of the next 80 years is the remaking around an idea of birth equality, that we're born equal. And I have 4 main characters for this one. And because it's a more inclusive demographic story about Black equality, female equality, my characters are a little bit different. I had 6 white men before. I have 1 white man who towers, Abe Lincoln, but alongside him, I got Frederick Douglass, a Black man, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a white woman, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, another white woman. And then if I'm lucky enough, if God gives me enough years, volume 3 will take the story from 1920 to the present moment. And then Americans will actually have what I hope is a serviceable account of our entire constitutional experience as a people.
And I just add, especially for an audience like this, the Federalist Society, one of the special things about the first book was it was a story of our constitutional founding, but it's not just sort of legal doctrines, right? It is a real story full of accounts of how people debated the Constitution, but also the imagery that they used in and around the founding. And there's a lot of that in the second book as well. I can't help, Akhil, I have to point out where you said 4score. Of course, that was, that refers to Lincoln's famous 4score and 7 years ago. And Lincoln himself was hearkening back to the biblical language of the book of Psalms, right? The line that most lives are maybe 3score, or if we're lucky, 3score and 10. So when Lincoln says 4score and 7, it's a reminder that in many ways we're past the normal lifespan of individuals, of course, as Professor Amar just said, but also perhaps for a country, right, as he's speaking at Gettysburg. I just couldn't help but point that out. This book, though, this volume starts in 1840, and it starts with a very, very interesting story. Akhil, could you just explain a little bit about how the book begins, where it begins, and why you begin there?
It begins actually in 2 different ways. The introduction actually starts with the opening words at Gettysburg, 4score and 7 years ago. Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Earlier this week, I was at Gettysburg. Yesterday, it was the anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. I was at the Lincoln Forum at Gettysburg, and every year, a whole bunch of Lincoln scholars and ordinary citizens who love Lincoln come together every year at Gettysburg to commemorate the address. Gettysburg is important both for the battle and for the address. So I begin that way. And since you mentioned 4score and 7, yes, it's greater than the lifespan of most people. But I also tell the story at the very beginning, and this is relevant for FedSoc folks. Lincoln is an originalist. He's going back to America's origins, and he locates those origins not in the Bill of Rights of 1789 to 91, or even the Constitution, 1787 to 89, when Americans draft and ratify the document. He says we begin, 4score and 7 years ago, a new, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation. We begin as a nation in 1776. He's saying this in 1863, you deduct 87, that's 1776. And he says our origins as a nation are continental, He's into geography, and they're principled. It's about liberty. We're conceived in liberty, not in slavery, and all men are created equal. That's our founding idea. That's our cornerstone idea. Not everyone agrees with that. Not everyone's going to interpret it the same way. But the introduction says Lincoln says this, and eventually his coalition is going to get the amendments in the Constitution that build on that. Created equal, born equal. So I start the introduction in Lincoln's voice, but then chapter 1 takes the scene back to 1840. And I say in the introduction, this book is about the roads to Gettysburg and the roads from Gettysburg. But then chapter 1 begins in London. And it begins with the world's first anti-slavery convention, idealistic, utopian, reform-minded people from all around the world, great leaders, philanthropists, politicians, journalists, scholars of all sorts come together in the world's greatest city, about 500 of them in all, to try to meet. It's the world's first anti-slavery convention, and they're meeting to try to come up with ideas for ending the world's great evil, slavery. Great, you say, oh, but there's a wrinkle. And there are Americans there, and there are Brits there, but on day 1, the first thing that happens is the men kick out the women. There are some women delegates. They're all Americans. There are only 8 of them, but Americans have sent over some prominent female anti-slavery delegates, and the male delegates, overwhelmingly Brits, say, oh no, we can't have that. So from the beginning, we're seeing tensions between Britain and America. They're abolitionists first. They're abolishing slavery in 1776 in places like, beginning in 1776, like Philadelphia and Massachusetts, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts. Americans abolished slavery way before the Brits do so in the empire in 1833. And so Americans say, like, we're the oldest and the best, and the Brits say, go away. We know you've picked women, but we're not interested in letting them sit with us. And the Americans are offended, and there's some tensions between Britain and America. And there are tensions between a project of Black equality and female equality, tensions between, are we simply trying to end slavery, or do we have an even broader egalitarian project that we believe in? So it's London in 1840. And also, finally, I have one of my 4 main characters is there. Yeah. She's Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She's on her honeymoon. At the beginning, in the first sentence of chapter 1, she's Elizabeth Cady. By the end of that paragraph, she's gotten married. She's Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and she's refused to utter the word obey in her vows because she thinks it's an equal relationship. That's interesting. They honeymoon. The reason she gets married in a hurry because her groom wants to go to London to be a delegate at this London convention. So they're on a working honeymoon. Oh, and poor Henry Brewster Stanton, because his boss is opposed to female participation, and his bride is quite an ardent feminist. He's on his honeymoon. Oh, what would you do? And when your bride is, an ardent feminist, and your boss is quite an anti-feminist. So that's part of the drama of chapter 1.
Yeah, that's another good thing about the book. It's a good lesson. Never have your honeymoon on a work trip. Never, ever, ever. Not a good idea.
And I did that. I'm an idiot. Okay, so you're actually reminding me now. That's why I found this so interesting. And it was fine, but I should have done it better.
Now, Akhil, just to flash forward to the end of this volume, though, your book starts with the Conference on Abolition, and it tees up both this question of, well, all men are created equal, but what about blacks? What about slaves in America? But then there's also the question of, well, what about women? And so your book ends in 1920, and just maybe explain to folks who aren't already picking up on the reference, that's the ending point that we're all swimming to here. What's 1920? So you know how the book ends. Right.
So Elizabeth Cady Stanton, on this working honeymoon, is offended that the men have kicked out the women, and she befriends. She's on her honeymoon, but she makes another friend. named Lucretia Mott from Philadelphia, who's a great Lucretia is actually an elected delegate. Elizabeth is just the wife of a delegate. But when the women are kicked out, a young Elizabeth says to an older and more established and famous Lucretia Mott, "Darn it, when we get back to America, you and I are going to have our own convention, and we're going to invite the women." That becomes, in 1848, Seneca Falls. And it generates a document, again, hearkening back to the founders. Lincoln isn't the only one who quotes the Declaration. So do Elizabeth and Lucretia. And they're joined by a Black man at Seneca Falls named Frederick Douglass. And they launch a document called the Declaration of Sentiments. It rhymes with independence. And they say, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal." And in a companion document embraced by the Seneca Falls Convention, which includes a lot of women and some men, including Frederick Douglass, they commit themselves to the principle of female equal suffrage. Okay, that's 1848, a few years after the London Convention, and it's spearheaded by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She lives in Seneca Falls. That's why the convention is there. Now, the last chapter and the end date, 1920. Elizabeth is dead. Lucretia is dead. Henry is dead. Frederick Douglass is dead. Lincoln, of course, is dead. He hasn't come on stage at the beginning of the book yet, quite, but he's in the introduction 7 years ago. So, but there's one woman who was at Seneca Falls who's still alive. She was 17 years old or so at Seneca Falls. She's now in her 90s. She lives in Philadelphia, which is the place where the Declaration was drafted and the Constitution was drafted. She knows she's the last living woman, and she's still a crusader for women's rights. And the book ends in Philadelphia on Election Day, 1920, when the 19th Amendment has just been ratified, and therefore women across the land are going to be voting on equal terms with men, a culmination of a birth equality project that travels through Seneca Falls and Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War, and at least four amendments. A 13th that says we're born equally free. No one's born a slave. No one's born a slave master. A 14th that says Americans, if you're born under the flag on American soil, you're born an equal citizen, whether you're born black or white, male or female. A 15th Amendment that says whether you're born black or white, you're equally eligible to be a voter eventually. And a 19th Amendment that says whether you're born male or female, you're equally eligible to be a voter. These are what I call the birth equality amendments. That's the book is about, Born Equal. It's the four amendments that are probably the most dramatic in this period. There are some other amendments as well. And so, yes, we begin with Lincoln's language and the roads to Gettysburg. And then we go to London where the men kick out the women. And Elizabeth says, we're going to have our own darn convention. And we end with the last living woman from Seneca Falls watching as actually, indeed, women get the vote everywhere.
Now, we can't possibly do justice to all the themes of this book. It's a big and thick and thoughtful book. But I do want to touch on a couple of broad themes.
Oh, it's big.
That's right. Before we delve into a few of the characters, I'm just curious, Akhil, when you're telling a story of America coming to grips with the real meaning of the Declaration of Independence and the promise of equality, and you're intertwining these two stories, the ending of slavery, recognizing the equality of blacks, and then eventually women's suffrage and recognizing the equality of women. What do we learn about those two stories by telling them together?
We learned that Adam, you gave the answer, which is like the double helix. Okay. They sometimes come together and they sometimes pull apart. And Elizabeth and Frederick are there together championing woman suffrage in 1848. But at the end of the Civil War, the Republican Party, for reasons I explained, is willing to embrace black suffrage because the blacks are going to vote for the Republican Party, but not female suffrage. women are going to actually probably Southern women may vote one way, Southern and Southern white women and Northern women a different way. So the Republican Party doesn't find it initially in its self-interest to the same extent when it comes to woman suffrage as when it comes to a black suffrage. And Frederick Douglass says, in principle, everyone should be equal, black and white, male and female. You're right, Elizabeth, but let's take a half loaf now. Blacks need it most of all because of all the horrible things that are being done to blacks. And Elizabeth is steamed. She's very upset at this. She says, you know, like all or nothing, this isn't right, this isn't fair, and this is how she says it. And sometimes she sounds bigoted. You know, uneducated black people. She sometimes even uses the word ignorant men are getting the vote before people like me, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who's very well educated, very well read. Me, I and some of my sisters, we went to Radcliffe, we went to Smith and Vassar. We're not getting the vote. And these illiterate, uneducated men are. So sometimes they're working together, Frederick Douglass and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Sometimes they're pulling apart. Frederick Douglass is always for women's suffrage. And indeed, I tell the story of his last day. He actually attends a women's rights convention and then goes home and drops dead. But yes, they sometimes come together, sometimes pull apart. And of course, they're not mutually exclusive categories. Some blacks are female and some females are black, and half the slave population was female. And the person who emphasizes that most of all, since we've now mentioned Abe and Frederick and Elizabeth, and I'm kind of on a first name basis with them, and I'll try to introduce you to them in the audience. But my fourth main character is Harriet Beecher Stowe. Oh, and she writes about slave women. She writes very much as a woman, about women, about Eliza Harris and others. So and I was not on a first name basis with my heroes in volume 1. No one called General Washington George, you know, or even, although he was very homespun, he was Dr. Franklin. Very few people would call him Ben. Okay, it's Mr. Adams, but it was Honest Abe. People called him, you know, by his first name. He didn't mind that. It's a different period. That's part of the historical story. Is yes, you're right. How images change. So I have a lot of art in the first book. Oh, but now I've got actually photographs. You know, I still have oils and paintings in part 2, but we move from a painting era to a photographic era. Oh, we have the telegraph now, and that's going to change how, and we have newspapers that are going to come out much less expensively and more profusely. So I am interested in images and communications technology, all sorts of stuff.
I want to get to Harriet Beecher Stowe in a little bit. I'll be honest, that your approach to her place in this story might have been my favorite part in the book. I think I said that in my review. But let's start with of all those friends, the most famous of your friends, our friend Abe. Of course, there's been maybe more books written about Abraham Lincoln than any other American. I'm always
Than any other person in the world, with the possible exceptions of Napoleon, Hitler, and Christ. It is at least in the English language. Yeah.
And I'm always struck when I pick up a book about Lincoln and I learn something new, or I relearn something in a different way. It's always interesting how authors can find something new to teach about Lincoln or to teach from Lincoln. So what do we learn about Lincoln in this book, reading about him alongside these others? How do we better understand Lincoln in Born Equal?
There's lots of stuff, but for this audience, the biggest thing of all to understand is he's an originalist. Okay, he's going back to America's origins. Oh, there are times when he sounds like our, you know, like Antonin Scalia. I can read you one passage in particular from his inaugural address, when he says, "The intent of the lawmaker is the law." Okay, and that's even pre-Scalia. That sounds Borkian. It's not original public meaning, it's original intent. And you read his Cooper Union address, and he goes by framer, by framer, by framer, and says they actually wanted slavery to end. And he goes through, you know, one by one by one. he's not making just pure policy arguments or philosophical arguments. He's an originalist, and he will also follow the written Constitution even when he doesn't like it. He hates slavery. He says that. That's a direct quote. I hate slavery. He says if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember a time I did not so think and feel. It's visceral for him. And yet he says there's this clause in the Constitution. Yeah, it doesn't say fugitive slaves, but that's what it was about. Everyone knew that's what it's about. I will enforce it, even though I don't love it because it's in the Constitution. We have to have fair procedures. And eventually I want to get rid of slavery. We may need to amend the Constitution, but we're going to do it without, cheating. We're going to, so the biggest point is, and it's hiding in plain sight. 77 years ago, the Cooper Union Address, the Lyceum Address, the first inaugural address. He's a nobody from nowhere. A one-term member of the House of Representatives, and he gets himself elected president. And I say it's because it's an originalist country that's proud of its origins, and he can tell the story of the Constitution and the Declaration and how they need to be woven together and viewed in a certain way better than anyone. So there are lots of things that I tell you about Lincoln, but for this audience today, I think that might be interesting. Before Bork was my teacher, but before Bork, I really respect Ed Meese. I have some disagreements with Scalia, but he's a very important person, and I actually wrote the foreword to the posthumous edition of A Matter of Interpretation.
Oh.
So, but before Clarence Thomas and Ed Meese and Antonin Scalia and Robert Bork, before Hugo Black, the great originalist of all time, I claim, is Abraham Lincoln. And that's been hiding in plain sight, but no one has given it a name. Yes, the word didn't exist, originalism. It was coined by my colleague and friend, co-author Paul Brest, but the idea did. And Lincoln criticizes precedent. He criticized Roe versus Wade. Oops, I mean Dred Scott. But he says you just made that up the same way that people today said, oh, Roe made things up. So yeah, that's probably for this audience the most interesting thing. And it's a reminder that originalism is not left or right. It's people, because Lincoln is left of center and it's not just about judicial interpretation. It's about all of us. Citizens can be originalists. People running for the Senate can be originalists. Presidents and presidential candidates can be originalists. That's probably the biggest thing for this audience.
Right. And again, one of the main themes of this book, that the Constitution is not just for the lawyers. It's something that Americans have all debated and grappled with and been part of. And
just Adam, on debate.
Please. Yeah.
Just, think about this. Lincoln comes to public attention nationally because of the Telegraph via a series of constitutional debates with another lawyer up and down a state. That's first for the Senate race of 1858. But this is astonishing. Farmers, their spouses, their kids are coming from miles around. There's no World Series, there's no college football. So they're just showing up, like a Field of Dreams, like out of cornfields, to listen to these two lawyers debate constitutional fine points about Dred Scott or the meaning of the Declaration of Independence. It's astonishing.
Yeah, the notion of lawyers arguing as a form of pop culture entertainment, it really does prove the past is a foreign country. But Akhil, let's turn to another one of your friends, Frederick Douglass, because of course Douglass himself thought a lot about the founding. He thought a lot about the connection between the founders and the people of his own time, our founding ideals and the ideas of his time. Tell us a little bit about Frederick Douglass's role in this story. Obviously, he was central to America's great awakening on the need to end slavery. But what more do we learn about Frederick Douglass in this book?
We learn a lot about America, too, in this book. He's the most photographed American of the century. So that's interesting. And he's trying to get himself photographed to prove to people, hey, I'm actually really a black person, because he's so articulate. Some people say, oh, he's just like a white person, posing in blackface. So he's telling you about that. No one was ever born lower than Frederick Douglass. He's born a slave. He doesn't ever even know his birth date. You know, we know the birth dates of our pet dogs and cats. He never knows that. He doesn't know who his father is. And yet he teaches himself to read. He escapes slavery, becomes this astonishing orator and writer. So he's born as low as it's possible to be born and rises to meteoric heights. He becomes an important public servant by the end of his life. So Lin-Manuel Miranda captures the drama of Alexander Hamilton. How does a bastard orphan, son of a, so he's low born and rises, and Lincoln is low born in the dirt and rises, but no one is born lower than Frederick Douglass. So what does it say about this period in America, that someone could go from the very bottom of a very hierarchical society and rise so high? That's interesting. But people read him, and he writes about himself, 3 autobiographies, but he writes about other people too. He's a little bit like Picasso in that he goes through various phases. And early on, he says, "Oh, the Constitution sucks. It's an agreement with hell. It's a covenant with death. It's pro-slavery." And he realizes intuitively, I can't point to the one passage of it, but right. I think he realizes that's actually not the way to persuade people. The way to persuade people in an originalist culture is to embrace the Constitution, not to spit on it, not to burn it. So he becomes actually a constitutional utopian, so much so that he pretends as if the Fugitive Slave Clause doesn't mean fugitive slaves, because it doesn't say fugitive slave. Okay. Right. Now, here's where he's right. They were ashamed to use that word, and Lincoln emphasizes that as well. But Lincoln's going to say, yes, they were ashamed to use it, and so to redeem that word, to redeem their best ideals, we have to end it. That's our North Star. But for the moment, that clause really is about fugitive slaves. Says Lincoln, I'm going to enforce it. Frederick Douglass pretends it doesn't quite exist. So there are differences between them. And he begins by being very harshly critical of Abe Lincoln. He says Abe Lincoln is a sellout. And he even says, this is after Lincoln is elected, the guy can't even write a good sentence. Really, he's that kind of unfair to Lincoln. Yeah. But then events occur that bring the two men together. And he visits Lincoln 3 times in the White House, only 3 times, and I narrate those 3 encounters, and he comes by the end to love Lincoln and see his greatness, America's greatest Black man, America's greatest white man, and the bond that forms between them, because Lincoln recognizes a kindred spirit, a soul. Like, I was born a day laborer in the dirt, and I kind of worked my way up by reading newspapers and thinking, this guy's not so different from me. Yes, skin color's different, but we have, and Lincoln didn't know that many smart Black people in Illinois, but Lincoln recognizes Douglass, and Douglass recognizes Lincoln, and they come together, because Lincoln eventually realizes he's got to free slaves in the South and convince them to join the Union Army, because that's what will win the war. And Douglass says, at last, I've got a shot now, because if Blacks fight for the Union, they're going to actually not just get their freedom, but they're going to be citizens. They're not going to be colonized and exiled. We're fighting for our native land. And if we can just get in the fight, then eventually we're going to be citizens and voters. And Lincoln himself travels down that path. In 1857, he's not in favor of Negro citizenship, 57, 58, but he is by the end of the book, and he's in favor even of Blacks voting equally, because they're soldiers, they're brothers in arms, and the two men come together about ideals, but also their interests converge, because Lincoln needs Douglass's help to convince Southern slaves to flee the plantations and to join the Union Army. So that means the Southern Confederate soldiers are going to have to go back to their plantations because no one's, manning the home front. And so the South is going to have less human power supporting its economy. And if they jump from one side of the balance pan to the other, now they join the Union Army, that's a 2 for 200,000 Blacks in blue. And I narrate that, but also tell you the story of these 2 men. When Lincoln dies, his widow, Mary Lincoln, she would have said then. She didn't really she wasn't used to her maiden name, but Mary Lincoln gives Abe's favorite walking stick to Frederick Douglass, because he thinks Frederick Douglass, that Abe would have wanted that.
Yeah.
And it's a poignant story about what America can be at its best.
Yeah. Now, in addition to your four main characters and friends, Abe Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, in some ways there's a fifth character, a fifth crucial character in this book, Congress. Congress. Now, Congress is a they, of course, but it's also an it. And Congress is crucial throughout the story. The debates in Congress as the Republic begins to crumble, the debates in Congress through the Civil War, and especially in its aftermath as they are debating these new constitutional amendments. Then, of course, the debates in Congress on further legislation implementing those great Civil War amendments, which then gets, I think, I would say, short shrift from the Supreme Court and others. And then finally, again, Congress in the end with the 19th Amendment. Akhil, what role does Congress play in the story that you're telling?
Because I'm trying to tell a story that a high school kid could understand, and I want to suck people in high school and college, I often give you characters. So I'll tell you about Charles Sumner toward the end. Well, even in the middle, how he gives an anti-slavery speech and he gets beaten within an inch of his life and for giving an anti-slavery speech, and how on his deathbed, he says, "Don't let my civil rights bill die." So I personify Congress a little bit with someone like Charles Sumner. I personify Congress earlier a little bit with an amazing person, John Quincy Adams, one of America's greatest ex-presidents, perhaps the greatest ex-president in public office. So, and he's my missing link because I'm trying to tell a continuous story, Fellowship of the Ring, Two Towers, Return of the King. So, he's the one president who knew George Washington and knew Abe Lincoln. And indeed, he names his firstborn George Washington Adams, and Abe Lincoln is 15 paces from him when John Quincy Adams, collapses dramatically on the floor of the House of Representatives. So he embodies Congress in some ways in my narrative, and he comes up with the idea that even though ordinarily Congress doesn't have power to end slavery or even to free slaves across the board in a state, it's not one of the enumerated powers of Congress. In order to win a war, you can do almost anything constitutionally, especially if it's an existential war. You can free slaves to win a war. That's John Quincy Adams's idea. He says, "Oh, Lord Dunmore, during the American Revolution, issued a proclamation freeing slaves. Oh, and the Brits freed slaves in the War of 1812. To win a war, you can free slaves." And he knows this because he negotiates with the Brits in the aftermath of the 1812 war about the slave emancipations and whether compensation is owed from Britain to America and all the rest. That's going to become Lincoln's theory in the Emancipation Proclamation. In order to win a war, as a genuine wartime measure, I can order the freeing of slaves. So, and yes, you're absolutely right. Amendments come from Congress. This is especially about remaking America's Constitution, about the amendments. So, what I do in the book is tell the story of the amendments in a way different than any way I've seen before, not giving you the blow-by-blow in Congress, but showing you how these amendments emerge from Congress because they're building on 20 years of discourse between the two parties, the anti-slavery party that kind of forms with the Free Soilers in 1848. And who's their vice presidential nominee? Charles Francis Adams, who is John Quincy Adams' son. So how these amendments actually are precipitated by a 20-year constitutional conversation kind of really beginning in 1848 between the parties.
Absolutely. And I just want to say one of the reasons why I love the treatment of Congress in this book is it's a good reminder that for real long-standing or long-lasting decisions about even our sort of renewing our fundamental principles, renewing our vows, so to speak, it requires Congress. It can't be imposed by a single president. It can't be even imposed by a Supreme Court. Statesmen in the White House or in the court or outside of the court, like Douglas and like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Harriet Beecher Stowe, they can inspire and they can teach and they can lead. But the role of Congress in debating this, oftentimes violently, literally violently, but in the end, come to a point where you can pass constitutional amendments and send them out for ratification, that you can pass civil rights legislation, that it's that kind of work that really in our country can only happen in Congress. And I think this book does a great job of that. But I just add one more thing, Akhil. One of the things I like about your handling of Congress, you mentioned John Quincy Adams. If I remember correctly, and it's been a little while since I read that part of the book, that's one of the places where you really delve into the public's understanding of what happened in Congress, and you get into the artwork of the time or the news images of the time, the sketches and so on, and the ways in which things can happen in these moments that are immediately depicted in a way that calls to mind much older debates, things that have been familiar to a lot of the readers, whether it was the way certain characters in an image are posed, that they are in the journalism of the era really hearkening back to deeper older debates.
So 2 points. Just so, thank you for that. Even something that looks like it's unilateral, the Emancipation Proclamation. Oh, no, Lincoln is working very closely with Congress. Congress has passed 2 confiscation acts. And Lincoln, which are actually getting a little bit ahead of Lincoln, but he signs them. And then he does the emancipation. But he doesn't do it immediately. He announces that 100 days from now, I will issue this a final version, and Congress is in session and all this, and they're actually encouraging him and funding him. So even something that looks unilateral, like the Emancipation Proclamation, is very much he's working with his party in Congress. So there's that. And yes, the people are watching, and we get these important statutes even before the constitutional amendment, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, for example, that is the precursor of the 14th Amendment. So there's all of that. But yes, also the people are watching. One of the technical legal points that I loved mentioning, and it brought a lot of things together, is the gag rule debate. The Southern slavocrats say anti-slavery petitions can't even be introduced in Congress. And John Quincy Adams becomes, a crusader against this, old man eloquent, and eventually he prevails. Why does it matter so much whether an anti-slavery petition is immediately tabled on the one hand or accepted and buried, and ignored on the other? Here's why it matters. Because if Congress accepts the petition, then it's permissible for all the newspapers to reprint it without being subject to being prosecuted for seditious libel or something like that, because it's the thing called the republication privilege. Something that's said in open court can be reported on in newspapers. Something that's anything that actually is said in Congress, newspapers can cover it. In the Alien and Sedition Act controversy, if you criticize the Sedition Act in the newspapers, you'd be prosecuted under the Sedition Act itself. But if state legislatures, the Virginia and Kentucky state legislatures, can issue resolutions, that's a speech spot, newspapers can reprint them, and you can't go after the newspapers. The irony is, of course, that in the Alien Sedition Act controversy, the newspapers are actually reprinting stuff in state legislatures critical of John Adams. Yeah. Now, in this reversal, it's John Quincy Adams using the national legislature to actually generate pieces of paper that newspapers can publish. So there are these delicious ironies in the whole thing, that the son of John Adams championing free speech when Adams sometimes actually had suppressed free speech. And it turns on technical legal things like what lawyers call the republication privilege.
Akhil, when we were discussing Frederick Douglass a little while ago, it called to my mind a couple of essays that Justice Thomas, then EEOC Chairman Thomas, published before he was appointed to the D.C. Circuit and then the Supreme Court. He was one of the first to really draw attention to the connections between our founding principles and the example explicitly of Frederick Douglass and the way we interpret the Constitution today. Now, it's always been a little... It's a never-ending debate, especially among conservatives and libertarians, over how much of the founding, how much of the Declaration to bring into constitutional adjudication? That's a question that anybody reading this book and the volume that preceded it, any of the lawyers, are surely thinking, what does this mean for the work of lawyers and judges? So what does it mean for the work of lawyers and judges?
First, a big shout out to my friend Clarence Thomas. I'm more admiring of how he has thought about originalism, truthfully, and done it than the late Justice Scalia. And because Scalia often turned constitutional interpretation into a dictionary game, a text game, whereas Justice Thomas has looked always to history. And as someone who writes history, I love it that a justice is actually reading my history book or someone else's and looking at the primary sources. Justice Scalia did not do that nearly as much as Justice Thomas, and I'm on Justice Thomas's side on that. And he's always been that way, even before he was a justice, as you mentioned, the EOC. So there's that. But especially where constitutional texts reference or build on the Declaration, wow, there's a good argument for paying attention to the Declaration because they've in effect been incorporated in the Constitution itself. So the Constitution has provisions about jury trials, and there's precursor language about jury trials in the Declaration of Independence, for example. Now, this language, it's how the introduction begins. And dedicates the proposition that all men are created equal. Well, that's in the Declaration, 7 years earlier, 1776. It's not in the 1787 Constitution. It's not in the 1789 to 91 Bill of Rights. So, but thanks to Lincoln, versions of this idea become the foundations of Amendments 13, 14, 15, and 19. The word created has become born in the first sentence of the 14th Amendment, but it's building on this idea of birth equality, creation equality. You should not be exalted or demeaned, deified or degraded because of accidents of your birth, because you're born with one skin color or another one, because you're born black or white. Jew or Gentile, in wedlock or out of wedlock, born to citizen parents or to non-citizen parents. The 14th Amendment says we're born equal citizens if we're Americans under the flag. The 13th says we're born equal in our rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. No one's born a slave. No one's born a slave master. 15 and 19 are going to say we're born equal even for political rights like voting and jury service and the rest. So once these amendments get put in the Constitution and you know your history and you know these are Lincoln amendments and you know that Lincoln at every turn is emphasizing the Declaration of Independence, these two texts now begin to knit together if originalism is done, I think, the right way. But you won't see this if you just look at words and dictionaries. You're going to see this, which is Scalia's approach sometimes. You're going to see it more if you have Thomas's approach, where you read primary sources and secondary literature in history.
Now this is a question that would take not just minutes, but hours or years to answer, but what about the sort of the perennial debates around judges and the 14th Amendment or the 19th Amendment's broadest words, the role of the judge in adjudicating whether something is a right under the 9th Amendment, whether it's a privilege or immunity under the 14th Amendment? Just really briefly, because we don't have much time, how will this book inform people's understanding of judges and lawyers' application of those parts of the Constitution?
I do show you that the privileges and immunities clause is key. I show you that with images. I show you they have a different idea sometimes about rights than the framers did. So the Second Amendment, just to take Scalia and Thomas, the Second Amendment really is mainly about militias at the founding. And I show you that with images like Bunker Hill. And you could say there's an individual right to have a gun in the home for self-protection at the periphery. It says keeping arms as well as bearing them. Bearing arms is paradigmatically military. Oh, but let's take a woman. She needs a gun in the home for self-protection, but she's not part of the militia. It's a bit of a stretch to actually get robust gun rights in the home for self-protection from the Second Amendment. And Scalia has to stretch a bit in Heller. Enter the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment says no state shall make or abridge any law which shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. And they mean black people, and they mean women too. Women are citizens too. Elizabeth Cady Stanton likes those words. She doesn't like other words in the 14th Amendment that put the word male in, but that's about women and blacks. And it's about a right to have a gun in your home for self-protection. And I show you that with art. Actually, I can even, look up the page right here. It's from Harper's Weekly, and that sounds a lot like Clarence Thomas's opinion in Bruin. It also sounds a lot like his concurrence in City of Chicago versus McDonald. So if you look at the book, I do think you'll, and this is, by the way, if you have these privileges and immunities of citizenship against states, under the first sentence of the 14th Amendment, you'd have them against the federal government too, because you're a citizen. I am a Roman citizen, says Paul. I have rights, St. Paul, as a citizen. So here's an image where the top is Bunker Hill, and it's very military. The bottom is the Freedmen's Bureau in the 1860s, and it's civilian arms bearing. Blacks have to have guns in their homes for self-protection. Wow, that's an interesting, and Scalia never quite saw that and said that. Thomas did. So you're seeing the differences in their two approaches.
Interesting. Now, a couple of questions come in. One just asked, will this event be recorded for future use? Yes, absolutely. It'll be on the Federalist Society's YouTube website. Someone asks, did women in the anti-suffrage movement, the opponents of women's suffrage, did they depart from founding values altogether or defend and understand them differently? That's a really interesting question, Akhil. I mean, obviously, when we think about the debates around slavery and the equality of blacks, we practically always tie that back to debates about the founding and the principles of the Declaration of Independence. How about the women's suffrage movement? How much of that harkened back to founding principles in the political rhetoric on both sides, and how much of it was focused much more in then contemporary terms?
Well, not all women are in favor even of women's suffrage. And chapter 3, which is called Seneca Falls, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are advocating for all sorts of rights, and they're as one. Remember, they meet at London in 1840 on Elizabeth's working honeymoon. She meets this amazing woman and says, when we get back to America, because Lucretia's been kicked out the convention, let's hold a women's convention. And Lucretia Mott believes in women's rights. But when Elizabeth shows her, actually, a version I think is called the Ninth Resolution or something, saying there should be equal voting, Lucretia, who's this staunch advocate of women's rights, just you will make Lizzie, thou will make us. She speaks as a Quaker. Thou will make us look ridiculous. So this is a little bit far for Lucretia, and the one who stiffens Lucretia's spine is actually a black man named Frederick Douglass. But yes, the women at the beginning are not all in favor of even women's suffrage. And I tell a story about how more and more women come to join that crusade over the course of a 70-year period. And the catch-22 is even if they're in favor of women's suffrage, they can't vote themselves the vote initially. So, but then eventually they get the vote in some places. But how, even if you have the vote in some places, do you get the vote in other places? But we should not assume that even in 1920, that all women believed in women's suffrage. Most of them by then, I think, had come around, but the story is told about how they did, in part because of women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her ally Susan B. Anthony, and the next generation of women crusaders, and black women, as well as white women, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Ida B. Wells, lots and lots of women of all sorts. But the irony is at the beginning, since basically women don't vote anywhere, they had voted a few of them in New Jersey before my book began, but that had been repealed. They can't vote themselves the vote. So they got to count on men, their allies, at least in the first instance, to give them the vote. Why would men ever do that? Oh, it's an interesting story.
Yeah. Now, Akhil, we only have a handful of minutes left, and I have two questions. And one question comes from the audience. It's from Miranda Sherrill, hearkening back to the beginning of our conversation when I said that your book's discussion of Harriet Beecher Stowe was maybe my very favorite part of the book, and it really was. We talked before about the fight for women's rights and women's equality, and the fight for black rights, black equality, sort of coming and going, crossing paths, and then departing. What I loved about the book is the way in which you make a point. It should be obvious, but it wasn't obvious to me until I read it, that Harriet Beecher Stowe uniquely identifies the coming together of women's equality and black equality. Of course, in terms of black equality, it's in the book she wrote, Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Eliza,
Right?
Cassie,
Right.
yes.
So maybe a few words about Harriet Beecher Stowe's role in all this, and then we'll close. I'll ask you about the next book.
She's America's first female superstar. She's the first woman who actually everyone is talking about politically. So before Taylor Swift or Beyonce or Hillary Rodham Clinton or Elizabeth or excuse me, Eleanor Roosevelt for that matter, or Kamala Harris. Okay, because Abigail Adams is important, but she's off stage.
Right.
And now there's a woman and she's writing about the biggest issue in America, slavery, and that book sells more copies than any other book in the century.
Yeah.
Abroad and in America, more than Moby Dick and Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer and Scarlet Letter. And she's writing as a woman, not under a pseudonym. Like the Brontes actually wrote under pseudonyms: Currier, Acton, Ellis, Bell. Jane Austen, it's her 250th anniversary of her birth this year. I love Jane Austen, but she simply writes as a lady. No, Harriet is out there with her name, writing not just as a woman, but as a mother. Oh, and I do love her. And I hope my audience, will come to love her and learn about her. She has lost a child. She feels that in her very flesh. She's lost an infant. She knows how it feels for a woman to lose a child, and therefore she can empathize, maybe better than a man can, about how slave mothers are having their infants, their children ripped from, their embrace, how that feels. So she's an amazing participant in a political conversation in a way that no woman before ever had been.
Yeah, I really, really loved it. That part comes across so well in the book. And now, finally, the next book. I gather it'll pick up in 1921. How much can you tell us about the next book?
I was going to show you a slide, but I may not have time to do that. But I can tell you the title, at least the working title, Earth's Best Hope. It's a homage to Lincoln. We shall nobly win or meanly lose, the last best hope of Earth. I believe this country is the best hope of Earth because no other country, there are more democracies now than they used to be, thanks to the American Constitutional Project, but almost no democracy brings together the great-grandchildren of all the other continents. France doesn't do that. Germany doesn't do that. Norway doesn't do that. So we are the world in a way that no other country is. And the theme of the last 100 years has been America becomes more global. We engage the world. We keep getting into all these wars, and I don't know actually, these Asian wars in particular. I don't know quite what we have to show for it. So, but America becomes more global. And the world becomes more American. So we're out there in the world, and more people from the world are coming here. The Immigration Reform Act of 1965, for example, and we have all these wars, hot and cold. The founders hid behind their moats. It was a somewhat isolationist project. If you read even the Neutrality Proclamation or Washington's farewell address, and as late as World War II, 30 million Russians, Soviets die, and bombs rain over Britain, and Dresden is firebombed, and Berlin is reduced to rubble, and France falls, and it's just Pearl Harbor here. So, as late as the middle of the century, America is still hiding behind its moats. What happens when we venture out into the world? I think we are Earth's best hope. And in order to be Earth's best hope, we have to pay attention to the Constitution and the Declaration, because it's what we have in common. We don't have race, religion, first language. That's what we have in common. That's why I'm an originalist. There are other reasons I'm an originalist too. And I think your audience I hope they'll find illumination and inspiration in these books.
Well, folks, that's the next book you have to look forward to. But first, while he's finishing it, go back and read the first two books. Read The Words That Made Us, what was it, 1760 to 1820? Read the book
1840, yeah.
1840. The book we've been discussing today, Born Equal, Remaking America's Constitution, 1840 to 1920. And then you'll be well prepared to read the third book in the trilogy. But Akhil, it's been a pleasure to get to discuss the second book. As you could tell, I'm a big fan of the book, everybody, and but I also enjoy and appreciate the opportunity to discuss it with you, Akhil. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great.
Thanks to all.
Thanks, everybody.
On behalf of the Federalist Society, I want to thank you, Professor Amar and Mr. White, for your time and expertise today. I want to thank our audience for joining and participating. As always, keep an eye on our website and your emails for announcements about upcoming events. And thank you all for joining us today. We are adjourned.